Alors bonjour tout le monde, bon après-midi, good afternoon. We're going to start off the conference with Professor David Wachsmuth, Associate Professor at McGill School of Urban Planning, and he's the Research Chair in Urban Governance. So I'll be giving you a small intro to what David has been doing over the course of the last years, and then segue into his presentation. So David Wachsmuth is the Canada's Research Chair in Urban Governance at McGill University, where he is also an Associate Professor in the School of Urban Planning. He directs UPGO, the Urban Politics and Governance Research Group at McGill, where he leads a team of researchers investigating pressing urban governance problems related to economic development, environmental sustainability, and housing markets. A major focus of his work has been explaining a transition in policy and planning from identifying the city as a global sustainability problem to identifying the city as a solution to global sustainability problems. He is one of the world's leading experts on the impacts of short-term rental platforms such as Airbnb on cities around the world, and consults widely with municipalities and community organizations on designing appropriate regulations. Dr. Wachsmuth was published widely in top journals in urban studies and international media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, and the Washington Post. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll give it away to David.
All right. Bonjour tout le monde, je suis David Wachsmuth. Je vais parler en anglais parce que je suis certain que vous ne voulez pas écouter mon français. So thank you very much for, thanks for having me. It's been great to be here for the last 2 days, and I'm really excited to be part of closing off this event. What I'm going to be speaking to today is some brand new research, like literally just dropped in the last couple weeks, on the lived experience of evictions in Canada. And I'm going to, I'll tell you a bit about the project in a second, but I'm going to be kind of applying some of the findings to the Quebec context in particular, but also give you the broader perspective. You already heard all about UPGO, the Urban Politics and Governance Research Group, which I lead. So let me just jump right in to tell you about the research that I'm going to be speaking about today. So this is a report commissioned by the CMHC. So that's the QR code. You can download it. I'll show this again at the end. This has been a year-long project, the first kind of large-scale qualitative investigation of the experience of eviction in Canada. So we spoke to 88 Canadians with a recent experience of eviction across 4 different provinces, BC, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And we were asking kind of a range of questions, but basically boiling down to who's getting evicted, why are people getting evicted, and kind of what happens. So what happens in terms of how do people navigate the eviction process? What are their housing outcomes afterwards? Everybody we spoke to was someone who was stably housed by the time of the interview, which means actually we did not speak to anyone who's kind of currently on the street, but I'll talk a little bit about people's experiences with transitional housing and as well as with being unsheltered. But we also then tried to really focus on what are some kind of next steps we can take from the work, and particularly from participants' own experiences of eviction that could better inform policy around eviction prevention and also kind of mitigating some of the negative impacts of evictions on people's lives when they are evicted, for example, homelessness. So this is a kind of wonky, crazy diagram here that I'll leave up for a second just to give you kind of a very quick overview of kind of how we approach the relationship of eviction with the housing system in general. Well, we kind of understand, okay, yeah, I don't know if you can see the little red dot here. The recent research in Canada has distinguished between what used to be called kind of, like fault or no fault evictions, but what we now kind of think of as tenant factor evictions and landlord factor evictions. So tenant factor evictions, you didn't pay the rent, or there was property damage or kind of antisocial behavior, landlord goes to the tribunal or to whatever the tenancy board is and gets an order to have you evicted. Landlord factor evictions, kind of a new way to think about all the other reasons why people are forced to leave their homes, which are basically driven by landlord decisions. And don't have anything to do with specifically what a tenant was doing. So the big ones here are own use repossessions. The landlord wants to move into the unit or has a family member who wants to move in. Or what we call rent evictions, dem evictions, so situations where the unit is being renovated and you need to leave. I'll return to this in a little bit, but the notion is that when we think about kind of risk factors that, that lead to either the kind of tenant factor or the landlord factor evictions, we can think about them as coming from socio-demographic causes. We know that there are a set of individual level attributes which make people at higher risk of eviction. Some of those are, for example, income. If you're on a low income, you lose your job, you don't have enough to pay the rent, that's going to lead to an eviction in a lot of circumstances. But some of them reflect, forces of structural disadvantage, discrimination. So, race, gender, age, disability, parenthood. There also are neighborhood level socio-demographic kind of risk factors or causes of eviction. And then on the other side, there are kind of what I'd call housing system causes. So all things being equal, if you live in a housing system that is less affordable, where there's less available housing, there's less suitable housing, then regardless of your specific individual characteristics, you are more likely to be evicted. And there's a point I'm going to return to again and again. But the notion is that kind of, these socio-demographic and housing system level causes kind of, produce evictions, but they are kind of mediated through another kind of important feature, which is tenant protections. Things which reduce tenants' risks of being evicted, which include rent and eviction control, kind of like formal government policies, but also collective tenant power. Ways that tenants are able to to kind of change the power dynamics, and so that's why these lines are thick up at the top and then kind of thin down at the bottom. And then the last point, and this is going to be one of the central ones for just kind of contextualizing the findings, is that evictions actually are not just a consequence of kind of like problems and they're a cause of those problems in people's lives, right? Evictions are the source of instability, and of course the kind of eviction to homelessness kind of pipeline in a sense is the most dramatic version of that. But there's been lots and lots of research, particularly in the United States, that makes it clear that if you are evicted, that is an event that launches you into future instability in your life, including in the housing system, but also in kind of your relationships, your employment, and the rest of that. So in other words, this is not kind of a one-way relationship. There's a cycle here. Okay, so that's the kind of the background. I'm going to return to some of these points as I go, but to be honest, this is a gigantic report with a ton of findings, and I really want to just kind of, at warp 9 here, you're going to see as I get closer to the end, my speed is going to pick up. I'm going to take you through the findings. Okay, this is not my fault. This slide looked good when I sent it in. I swear. But everything's on the table here. Just first of all, to give you a sense of kind of what the sample looked like. We interviewed 88 people who had recently been evicted, and we asked them about what caused the eviction. The first key point here is that 96% of our respondents were evicted for landlord factors. So we actually only spoke to one person who didn't pay the rent and got evicted. Now we didn't have a research design which lets us be confident that this reflects the kind of underlying demographics of eviction in Canada, because if we had to ask people to speak to us and they had to say yes, right? So but this actually does line up with other research that's been coming out of Canada recently, which suggests that most evictions these days are not driven by tenant factor such as non-payment of rent. They are instead driven by landlords wanting to get control of their unit back, basically for the purposes of raising the rent. We had a pretty even split between single household evictions and multiple household evictions. So, almost half of the people we spoke to, their whole building was evicted at the same time as them. We also asked about the type of landlord that did the evicting. And just to note here, we had a split between individual kind of family landlords and corporate landlords. Individual landlords were much more likely to have evicted people, one household at a time, whereas corporate landlords were much more likely to have evicted the whole building at the same time, right? Corporate landlords, generally speaking, gave the reason for the eviction was for renovations. Individual landlords, generally speaking, the reason for the eviction was for a repossession, for their own use. Now, I've got some kind of, something to say about these own use repossessions towards the end of the presentation. We can't necessarily take everybody at their word that that's what's going on, but that was at least what the landlords reported. So digging into now some of the kind of the context of folks who were evicted. One of the things we asked about was about people's previous experience of housing instability and discrimination in the housing system. And what we found was that, a majority of respondents had either had been previously evicted, had previously, had to occupy transitional housing or had been unsheltered, or had had some previous experience of rental market discrimination, usually in the form of like a landlord refusing to rent to them. Because of their individual characteristics. I'll note that actually Quebec stood out as having the highest proportion of respondents with this kind of previous history, geographically speaking. But what I'll also note is that Indigenous respondents were far more likely, more than twice as likely, to have reported previous housing instability than the non-Indigenous respondents. And also racialized and Indigenous men were far more likely to have reported previous housing discrimination than any other group. And this actually lines up with other research that's been done, which suggests that landlords are looking for tenants that they think will be unproblematic and docile. And so racialized and gendered stereotypes play heavily into that. Particularly white women are seen as kind of model tenants, and racialized men are seen as problematic tenants from the get-go. And certainly our findings speak to that. Now this is important because, as I mentioned at the outset, housing instability leads to housing instability. Right? So we have people who have had previous experiences here. It's not random who has been discriminated against and who hasn't, and that feeds on itself in the context of evictions. So one thing that's really important for understanding kind of what we can do with data about evictions in Canada is that only 1 in 6 of our respondents went to their provincial tenancy board, like the Tribunal Administratif du Logement. The vast majority of people left when they were ordered to leave by the landlord without contesting it at the Tribunal, which means that any time we're counting evictions using administrative records from the courts, we are going to be, our estimate is undercounting by a factor of 6 times, right? Only 1 in 6 people are going through the court system. Quebec really stands out here because most respondents in Quebec received a negotiated settlement from their landlord where they got 1 or 2 or 3 months rent, something like that. Nobody outside of Quebec, I think one person outside of Quebec got this kind of settlement. And this was a really striking thing. So nobody's going to the courts, but in Quebec, people are getting a cash payment from their landlord, and outside Quebec they're not. And what we realized very quickly was that this was driven by the existence of the housing committees in Quebec, the Comité Logement du whatever your neighborhood is, right? That almost all of our Quebec respondents, when they got the eviction notice, they went to their housing committee to ask for advice. And that advice was often along the lines of, you could fight this at the Tribunal, but you're probably not going to win, and maybe even if you do win, you're going to want to leave anyways because your landlord is going to be hostile. And instead, if you go to them and say, I'll leave if you give me 2 months rent, they'll probably say yes. And then you'll leave, you'll get the 2 months rent, and you'll have a better chance of landing on your feet. And outside of Quebec, nobody has access to that kind of advice because there isn't a housing committee system like we have here. The last point is that, in terms of how people negotiated the eviction process, is that COVID-19 made this a lot harder. So a lot of the people we were talking to were evicted during the pandemic, and both, the tribunal hearings for people who were attending them in different provinces were often moved online, which, provide kind of like access barriers, but also the need to find a new apartment during the pandemic is just a lot more difficult than it was beforehand. So for people, this is a time when people don't want to move. And so if you're forced to move because you're being evicted, that complicates things even more. So we asked folks about their sources of support during the forced move. And just to reiterate that, again, that most of our Quebec respondents reached out to their housing committees, and there was nothing like this elsewhere in the country. In Ontario, in fact, in particular, there was very little access to any kind of formal support from governments or from nonprofits, or from legal clinics or from paid lawyers. And in Quebec, that was very strong. Nobody went to the government in Quebec, like 0 respondents, but everybody went to the housing committees. Meanwhile, almost all our respondents relied on friends and family to help them navigate the move, which is, I don't think is surprising, but it's worth highlighting that, a lot of the support that people are drawing on in the context of this very kind of traumatic, difficult period of time is not coming from, civil society and the government. It's coming from people's own social networks. And so people with less well-developed networks are going to be in worse shape. So here's where we get into the question of homelessness. Before I kind of explain or describe the findings here, I want to be really clear that almost everybody we spoke to was not evicted for non-payment of rent or for things which were driven by kind of personal economic insecurity. In fact, our sample had, by the metric of how much of your money you're paying per month on rent of your income, our sample is better off than the Canadian average. You know, the Canadian average, 60% of households pay more than 30% of their income every month in housing costs. For our sample, it's more like 50%. So this is not a disadvantaged group of folks we were talking to, and yet a third of them were unable to find housing in the aftermath of their eviction and ended up either on the streets or in some kind of transitional housing. So we're not taught, and we didn't even talk to anybody who was not securely housed for ethics reasons. That was part of the protocol. So we're talking about a very privileged subset of the folks who were evicted. And among this very privileged subset, a third of folks were unable to secure housing once they had to leave their home. Racialized and Indigenous participants were nearly twice as likely as white participants to have occupied transitional housing or to have become homeless in the aftermath of the eviction. And actually, Quebec participants were much less likely than others to have occupied transitional housing. A fact which we think is connected to the idea that, that Quebec participants were getting payouts from their landlords. That they had a little bit more in the way of kind of opportunities in the aftermath of the eviction to kind of land on their feet in the housing system. It's also probably related, but we can't really prove this from the data, to just the kind of general kind of state of the housing market in Ontario and BC in particular. It has been very hard to find an affordable house for the last bunch of years. One of the things we did is we asked people to compare their housing before their eviction and then their kind of post-eviction stable housing. So, once they were out of the shelter system, for example. And I probably isn't surprising, but it's worth noting that people's housing situations got worse. So we created kind of a 4-point scale. Are you paying more or less? Do you have a bigger or smaller place? Do you have a higher or lower quality place? And is the location better or worse? So kind of tracking core housing need characteristics plus location. So you get -4, everything got worse, +4, everything got better. We're dealing with people with negative outcomes on the whole, right? And that breaks down unsurprisingly by other demographic characteristics. So actually, Quebec respondents on the whole had worse outcomes, across this set of factors. This was driven, as we'll see in a moment, by the fact that very few people in Quebec had access to social housing in the aftermath of their eviction, whereas in some other provinces it was better. People who paid more for their housing afterwards, people who paid less for their housing after the eviction got worse housing. People who paid more for their housing got worse housing. Some people got better, they paid more, but for the most part, even among people who were forced to pay more after they were evicted, they came out of this with housing which was smaller, in a less good area, of lower quality, despite the fact that they were paying more. One of the striking findings for us was that by far, the group with the best relative housing outcomes was people who ended up in non-market housing. So everybody we spoke to was evicted from the private rental sector. That wasn't a condition of participation, but it's how it turned out. And a decent minority of folks ended up in social housing, and they had the best outcomes, relatively speaking, in terms of comparing their previous housing with their housing on the outside. Ownership, people who ended up in ownership were the second best, and of course, we're not talking about a group of folks who are uniformly really disadvantaged, right? So for some folks, the eviction was the opportunity to go to mom and dad, borrow the money for the down payment, and move into their own homes. And folks who remained in the private rental sector had the worst outcomes, by a pretty substantial margin. Women respondents reported much better outcomes than male respondents, again, which kind of connects with what we know about how discrimination in the private rental sector works. And then lastly, people with a previous history of housing instability had substantially worse outcomes following their eviction, which again really reinforces the fact that you were evicted once. That is the kind of a predictor for being evicted subsequent times. It makes your kind of subsequent journey through the housing system a more difficult one. Okay, so a couple more things, and I want to kind of talk about what it all adds up to. We asked whether or not people were able to stay in their neighborhood, where they were able to stay in their city. Quebec respondents had the best chance of staying in their city. Almost 75% of people in Quebec who were evicted remained in their city. Almost nobody, the dark bar at the bottom is, did you stay in your neighborhood? Almost nobody was able to stay in their neighborhood. For parents, this was really bad news, right? Because you have kids who are pulled out of their school boards and that kind of thing. If you look at New Brunswick, only less than half of New Brunswick respondents were even able to stay in the same city. Most had to move cities, many had to move provinces. And some even left the country, actually. So there was but generally speaking, people had to move. Almost nobody was able to stay in the same neighborhood where they were evicted from. And many participants experienced a change in household composition. So we had a few very disturbing interviews with people who lost custody of their children because of their eviction. We had many people whose romantic relationships split up because of the stress of navigating the eviction. And of course, tons and tons of people who were in kind of roommate situations did not end up in those same situations. And I believe with only a single exception, basically every single participant experienced a wide range of negative emotional outcomes, with the kind of stress and anxiety, and then the fear of becoming homeless being the kind of three most commonly reported. Now, of course, again, a third of folks did become homeless, right, in the aftermath. But even among the two-thirds who didn't, I can't tell you how many times we heard a version of the story, which was, there was this one lucky moment that prevented me from becoming homeless. In one case in Vancouver, a single mother, racialized, who had been living in a basement suite, she got kind of saved, there was her words, by a YWCA caseworker who managed to get her into subsidized housing that was newly built, where at the point that she got that news, she was, they were gonna have to leave BC. They couldn't find anything. And so, she was able to stay in the neighborhood, better housing, cheaper rents, but everybody was well aware of how close they were to the edge. And again, just to be clear, we're not talking about people who were like struggling to make ends meet, in general. We're talking about a kind of a wide range of folks with a lot of different kind of economic resources. So if we kind of drill in on the Quebec experience here, Quebec actually stood out quite a bit in our study. First of all, because we did see kind of relatively poor post-eviction housing outcomes, but those that was kind of by the time you landed on your feet. In fact, in between, the thing that was really striking was the fact that people's transitions in Quebec from being evicted to having stable housing was much smoother. Very few people ended up in transitional housing compared to some of the other provinces. In BC and Ontario in particular, it was quite bad. And again, that we want to reiterate the unique role of the housing committees here, which really stood out as a resource for tenants in Quebec that just doesn't have any equivalent elsewhere in the country. And this is made for some kind of like conversations where we're talking to policymakers outside of Quebec saying, well, what you really should do if you want to support tenants in the context of eviction is get into a time machine, go back to the 1960s and 70s, get the Parti Québécois to fund this system of, it doesn't work, right? There's a kind of unique history here which has given us this resource, but just want to highlight how important that resource turned out to be for people navigating eviction. The last thing that I want to say here is that over the course of doing this research, my thinking about just how to think about evictions really shifted to a place where I think what I want to suggest is we should think about evictions as landlord behavior, landlord action, okay? And this is true if you're not paying if the tenant isn't paying the rent or if the landlord wants to do an unused repossession. Regardless, eviction is a choice by a landlord to make. And so if we think about evictions that way, what we need to do is we need to think about what are the factors that make landlords more or less likely to make the choice to evict their tenants, right? And I think that can be boiled down to kind of incentives and capacities. So here's this kind of cool 2x2 table, which I always like ending on, which kind of distinguishes between what are the kind of low or high incentives landlords have to evict. And one of the big factors, kind of structurally speaking, is the overall state of the housing market. If we're in a housing market where landlords know they can get higher rents if they can get their tenant out, because they know there are tons of people waiting for an apartment, they have, all things being equal, more incentive to evict. And vice versa is true if we've got more abundant housing supply, where if you evict your tenant, you may have to face the possibility of nobody filling that vacancy for a few months, and that's going to cost you money, maybe you won't do it. But then the other issue is, even if you want to evict your tenant, how able are you to do it? What is your capacity to evict tenants? And here, again, at a kind of higher systemic level, this boils down to what is the state of tenant protections. And so if tenant protections are weak, landlords have the capacity to evict very easily, and if they're strong, it's the opposite. So we don't live in a world with a loose rental market, right? There's nowhere in the country that looks like that. So these kind of boxes don't really exist in practice. But these boxes do. And I think Quebec is a situation where we can kind of pair, it's a tight rental market, has been for the last bunch of years, but relative to the rest of the country, there are stronger protections in place. And so what we see in this situation is cash settlements. Landlords are willing to pay people off to get the tenants out. But what we also see are evictions accomplished via loopholes. We've got strong rules in place, but but those rules aren't always enforced. And so this is the kind of big smoking gun that we found when we asked people about why they were evicted. And almost everybody who was evicted by an individual landlord, like not a corporation, said it was an own use repossession. But there was one big exception here, which is New Brunswick. Nobody reported this in New Brunswick, and we thought that's very funny. But then we realized that New Brunswick doesn't have any eviction protections. Landlords don't need to come up with a reason. They just tell you to leave, and then you have to leave. So in New Brunswick, landlords say, get out, and you leave. In Quebec, landlords say, get out, but they have to provide a reason. So what reason do they provide? An own-use repossession. And do they need to prove that repossession? No, they don't. So what we think is going on is that we have, on paper, quite strong protections, which in practice, landlords have realized don't amount to much more than the paper. So the recommendations that we came up with, and this is the final slide, is first of all that we really need to be scrutinizing own use repossessions quite a bit more. They're clearly the major avenue for abuse of the eviction system by landlords right now. We go into a lot of detail on this in the report, but basically the New Brunswick-Quebec comparison makes that clear. And that kind of following out from that, we think that we should be making tribunals, like the tribunal, the rule rather than the exception in eviction cases. Only 1 in 6 people, tenants, went to the tribunal. We think that a better model is that landlords should be forced to proactively demonstrate the need for the eviction at the tribunal before they can get an order. What that means is in the case of an own use repossession, they need to say who's going to be moving in and when they're going to be moving in. And then they should need to come back a year later to prove that that happened. Same story for our renovation. Let's see the permits, and then you can get the eviction order. Get a situation where the default is evictions need to be scrutinized by the provincial, by the tribunal, and don't happen kind of under the table, which is the current situation. And then lastly, this isn't a surprise, but it's just true, non-market housing produced the best outcomes for people getting evicted. If everybody could have moved into non-market housing, we would have had much more positive stories to tell. We need more non-market housing here. It's hard to say anything more than that. So with that, I will say thank you very much. Download the report if you want. It's gigantic, and there's lots of depressing stuff to read. There's probably no time for questions, but if there is, I'll take them.
Thank you. Very nice presentation. Thank you. I guess my question is about, I liked your analogy about the time machine, but I guess I wonder, is it the committees or is it what the advice they're getting, which is to ask for cash? And if it's the cash, I guess going back to what Eric was saying on day one, could you experiment and actually try to evaluate that question?
Yeah, right. No, I think it's the cash. It's not just the cash. Here are the two things that I think about this. One is that, again, just to reiterate, the people that we spoke to, which I think is, I can't prove, but my understanding from looking at some other research that's being done, I think we're pretty broadly representative of folks who are getting evicted right now in Canada, which is, it's landlords trying to raise rents, right? So, it's people who are in a range of different positions in terms of their ability to afford rent. They're not behind on their payments necessarily, but they're also often not able to suddenly just pay 30% more in rent next month, right, find a new place. The ability, the access to advice, savvy advice about what your rights are, but also in practice what your rights amount to, I think is important on its own terms. And the getting cash settlements, like that was the specific thing that the housing committees were able to offer, because it speaks to the general conditions of the housing market, right? Like landlords are really motivated to get you out; they'll pay, But that in general, we had a lot of variations of stories outside Quebec from people who basically said, "I just had no idea what was going on." I got the eviction notice. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't, sometimes you don't realize what the window is for when you can challenge it. You don't know what the challenging process looks like, how much it's going to cost you, those kinds of things. And in Quebec, we just didn't hear those stories, because what people said instead was, I went and talked to the Comité Logement, do whatever, and they told me the following things. So I think it is a kind of like a fundamental thing on its own terms. The cash settlements idea, I think, would be an interesting experiment on top of that.
I was surprised by your finding on repossessing of dwelling, because there is a lot of loophole in Quebec on reno eviction, because it's super easy to just say, I'm going to do renovation, tenants know that they cannot really do much, and then they just go out of it. So I'm pretty surprised that there's more repossessing of dwelling. And also what we noticed in some neighborhoods, they increase the protection for eviction against different types of eviction than it's increased the repossessing of dwelling, and then the one that doesn't have these protection, then it's more these types of eviction that they notice. So I don't know if you can explain more how you end up to that.
Yeah, I can be more clear here. So corporate landlords, which were a big part of the sample, they did not, generally speaking, say they were going to repossess the dwelling for family use, right? They were, so that's where the renovations were coming from. And so, I don't want to suggest that those aren't loopholes as well. But that, what we know, but the fact is that, most of the evictions were family landlords, like they weren't corporations. And the family landlords were much more likely to say own use repossession. And so that I'm not going to say that they were all lies. Like, in some cases, I'm sure it was the truth. In other cases, they were definitely lies. I mean, we had talked to one person who said she found out afterwards that everybody in her building got the own use repossession for the same sister. Like, that doesn't work. But yeah, I think that the idea is that, and again, in the report we talk about this some more, there are kind of different strategies, individual landlords, corporate landlords. The own use repossession is obviously for the individual landlords. Because I think that the corporate landlords, they have a kind of a better sense of the legal situation. They know what they're going to get away with. They know they know how to follow the letter of the law without, and so they're the ones who are talking about renovations above all. But definitely, they're both big opportunities for loopholes, is the truth of it.
My question is kind of like the tension between the collective interest in preventing these renovictions or evictions that are done for false reasons, and sort of the individual interest in getting that cash settlement, because it seems to me that, or from what I've heard from people who work in housing clinics, for example, like even if you do have the evidence that this eviction is, improper and you have all your ducks in a row, like if the landlord offers a significant cash settlement, the tenants may take that because it's in their interest to do that rather than stay, as the housing committee said. So I'm just wondering how that can guide policy and how you can balance those two factors.
Yeah, exactly. So my super boring answer to this is like my boring answer to everything about housing, which is that like the kind of broader market conditions like set so much of the scene for what makes sense strategically. And the fact is, just because we are living in this right-hand column, like we get a ton of dystopian outcomes from that. Where the same exact questions over in this left-hand column where there's lots of housing available, vacancy rates are high, we would see different decision-making here. So the big one here is that if we have, like, on the whole, high vacancy rates, lots of availability of rental housing, there will still be cases where the landlord really wants to do some renovations or actually really wants an own use repossession. And in those cases, they'll may be forced to put up a cash settlement. And it's totally reasonable if you're the tenant saying, I'll take this money because I can go find another place to live. I'm not really attached to my apartment. It could be your case, right? No problem. The problem is that we don't live in that world. We live instead in a world where you lose your apartment, regardless of how well off you are, it's going to be a huge crisis trying to find a new place to live. And so the cash settlements kind of help compared to not having them. But I think the tension you're posing actually isn't a tension in the real world, because we just live in this world where, like, basically it's a disaster to have to leave your apartment when you don't want to. But I agree with you that if we were in a situation where housing was more available, that would be a really interesting question about how to balance.
J'ai une question en français.
Okay.
Vous voulez pas entendre mon anglais?
Okay.
Ma question, c'est comment, parce que si on renforce la procédure d'éviction, comment en contrepartie, on rend pas plus difficile l'accès au logement? Dans le sens, un propriétaire pour qui ça va être plus difficile d'évincer un locataire risque d'être plus sélectif dans l'accès. Puis comment on s'assure de ne pas trop balancer dans l'inverse, parce qu'on sait déjà qu'il y a la discrimination à l'entrée au logement. Si on renforce encore plus, si pour un propriétaire c'est encore plus difficile, s'il pense avoir fait le mauvais choix de ne pas garder son locataire, comment on trouve un équilibre là-dedans?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I think like the answer is kind of, again, is about the kind of difference between being in like a tight market and a loose market, in that we want a situation where it's irrational for a landlord to want to evict a tenant, right? Except under conditions, again, if you have a tenant who is causing property destruction or who just hasn't been paying their rent, like, I understand, you're a landlord, you're trying to make money, like, it makes sense to evict that tenant. But we should want it to be, generally speaking, a bad idea to want to evict your tenant. And we can try to kind of set the laws up to accomplish that. But definitely the best way to do it would be for it to be a bad business decision. And again, I think if you think about the way that like the labor market works, the analogy is pretty clear. Like if you have a bad employee, you'll fire the bad employee, but you have to then hire a new employee. If it's hard to do that, you're going to be more cautious about firing the employee. We want to, so in other words, I think like if we expand the availability of housing, then on some level there's less to work. Then we can have strong protections so that landlords evict when they need to and otherwise don't. As far as the question of like, does it like reduce the it reduces landlords' incentives to be landlords? Again, right now the incentive, I think that's again a kind of a question that's better answered kind of before we start thinking about evictions, in the sense of that's a broader housing market question. What happens with evictions is like a few steps downstream of the kind of overall situation in the housing market. And the question of like, do we have enough supply of rental housing? Do people want to be landlords? Are they making those investments? I think that question gets answered before evictions really kind of come into the picture, basically.
Thank you. Your research is really interesting. I think especially confronts this sort of public image of who gets evicted and how. Like that really, I am like, wow, very interesting. But I'm, just from a researcher point of view, I'm curious, how did you recruit people for this?
With like enormous difficulty is the short answer. It was supposed to be, I'm kind of like, I'll need to cry to tell the full story. But anyway, we worked with like over 100 community partners who kind of, basically like frontline housing orgs, anti-poverty orgs, those kinds of folks, to kind of identify people who had been evicted. They ended up doing a lot of kind of social media outreach. So we did some of that, and then kind of had some pretty extensive procedures in place to validate who people were. So yeah, to be clear about this, like we didn't have, we had a kind of like a strategy for, we want to, and I cut all those slides because I was already way over time, to make sure that we have a sample that kind of matches some of the demographics that we understand about eviction. But the truth is that we actually, there isn't a lot known on the demographic level about that, so it's kind of hard to know what we should be targeting. So this is why I try to be clear that, like, for example, just because everybody in our sample was evicted for a landlord factor eviction, that doesn't mean that is actually what the broader landscape looks like. That's the people who agreed to talk to us. So there are some kind of those kind of sampling questions which are out there. And again, in the report, we kind of talk about how we dealt with that.
Thanks very much. The research was super interesting, and congratulations. It sounds like the culmination of a huge amount of work. Two questions for you. One, it has to do with the community service organizations that do exist in Toronto. Yeah. Center for Accommodation, yeah. CIRA, for example, that does a lot of the work that the community organizations do here. And so that leads me to ask your thoughts on whether or not the big issue here is less the community organizations than the existence of rent control at a universal level in Quebec. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And then the second one has to do with evictions to bring in a family member, and the same family member is going to live in 14 places. So my understanding of the rules for the Tribunal Administratif du Logement is that the tenant actually has the right automatically to refuse the notice of it's not eviction actually in Quebec, it's another word for it, and that the Tribunal du Logement actually automatically has jurisdiction once that refusal has been received. Yeah. So you already have a situation where the tribunal's automatically engaged. Yeah. So I wonder how that intersects with your comment about giving the tribunal jurisdiction. Thank you.
Yeah, these are great questions. So on the first one, I think, right, so people did, outside of Quebec, people did access community service groups for assistance. It's just that they did so with much less frequency. So, CIRA for sure in Toronto, in every case there's somebody doing that role. It's just that they were way less ubiquitous. So, I think that you can there are lots of ways that you could kind of explain that, but I think certainly the conversations we had supported the idea that the housing committees are kind of more baked into people's experience of being a renter here than elsewhere. As far as kind of rent control driving the story, there's, that definitely explains, I think, why some of that, ultimate housing outcomes were worse, relatively speaking, in Quebec, in the sense that people just universally paid more money afterwards because, you know, whatever apartment you're leaving, the rent's lower. Like, it's automatic, right? Like, so I think that is part of that story for sure. But otherwise, that's kind of, it's hard to, we're getting to a situation where there are lots of intersecting things because at the same time, you know, BC and Ontario had much higher rates of, you know, rent increases over those years and like just kind of generally like tighter rental markets. So which kind of like supplies some of the same like underlying dynamics of get rid, you know, it's hard to find an apartment. Your rent is going to go up if you have to move. As far as the thing about the own use possessions, you're totally right. The thing is that the cases just didn't go to the tribunal. People left, right? So that's again what happened here. That they were. You know, they were told by the landlord to leave. They went to the housing committee. The housing committee said, you could fight it, and you know, basically informing them of exactly these kinds of situations. But if you take the settlement, you know, they'll pay it to you, and yeah, you go. And of course, you know, in other provinces the situation is different. BC actually has something like this on the renovation side, which is to get like an actual eviction notice from the residential tenancies branch. For renovations, you do need to show up the permit. That was introduced in 2021, so it's kind of at the end of, we didn't really have access to people, that wasn't something we could kind of understand through the qualitative research, but we know that it's something that had happened recently. So there's a kind of you know, the situation looks different in the different provinces, and we're trying to kind of, you know, come up with something that speaks reasonably well to the different situations. But definitely the fact that mostly people just didn't go to the, you know, the tribunal or to the RTB or whatever is what was informing that.
Hi there, thanks for the talk. Just, maybe this is a very obvious question. You talked about the cycle of evictions leading to more evictions for the tenants.
Yeah.
To what extent are these evictions also contributing to the tight rental market and that kind of cycle of, do we have evidence about that and how this is feeding in? Or I know you have lots of other work on that, but I really wonder about that side of it. And then just in terms of the policy outcome, at least for Quebec, yeah. I mean, one thing is to have the comité recommending, hey, take the settlement because the régie is going to be the tribunal is going to be a long and cumbersome process and you might not win. But I mean, should the advice be, hey, look, fight it? Yeah. Because as a collective benefit, maybe we need to be protecting this as rent-controlled units that are not subject. So I just wondered about whether there's some pushback and rethinking of strategy and advice that moves from the individual to the collective. Yeah, so actually something in response to both those questions that I realized I didn't mention and probably should have is that I think that tenants brought up a ton in our interviews was that one of the reasons they didn't want to go to the tribunal is because they needed a recommendation, a reference from their landlord to find a new apartment, right? And that gets again to this point about like the overall state of the housing market. If we live in a housing market where landlords feel like very able to say, I'm just not going to consider a tenant who doesn't have a positive reference from the previous landlord, then you really can't risk having a bad situation with the landlord who's evicting you because you already know how tough it's going to be to find a new apartment. So as far as the kind of contribution of the evictions to the underlying kind of rental market conditions, I think one thing is that definitely that it's a kind of like, it's a tight loop where this kind of like structures where like housing's hard to find promote a certain type of behavior, which in this case is actually making it easier for landlords to get you to leave because you just don't want to fight, because you know that it's actually against your own self-interest. As far as the point about that being potentially, you know, there's the same point that was raised before about kind of like, is there a kind of collective interest, a tension between the individual and collective interest there? I think that that's a very fair point, but I think it's like, it's a hard one. It's a hard one to want to kind of prosecute at the level of advice to individuals who are facing this difficult moment in their lives. And the question of evictions feeding into a tighter rental market? So one thing here is that they are like turnover times for apartments are very short right now, right? Like you don't need to, like, you know, your tenant leaves, you get a new tenant in right away. So again, that's part of kind of why it's okay to do this. I think that's more of an outcome of tight rental markets. Like, you know, you advertise a listing, you've got 50 ad responses within the first hour, you know? Is that kind of situation. I think I'm getting the cane here dragging me off.
Well, we're 15 minutes over. This is awesome. Like, this is fantastic. I feel really bad for the translators.
I know. I'm so sorry. This was only half my normal top speed, so.
Oui, c'est ça. Moi aussi, j'avais comme 5 questions de plus, mais je vais mentionner un petit peu de peut-être la suite à ce sujet. Donc voilà, on est presque à la fin de notre conférence. Et on est tellement content d'avoir, d'une certaine mesure, lancé dans l'air toute la question de la prévention, de l'itinérance dans toutes ces différentes formes. En tout cas, les facettes de la prévention, ça commence peut-être à prendre un petit peu d'évidence maintenant. En tout cas, moi, je suis tellement touché et j'avais tellement appris des dernières jours et demi. Je suis tellement reconnaissant. Je vais revenir aux reconnaissances dans un instant. Donc, I'll do some final reflections in English, and you want to do it in French? I don't know, something like that. Okay. So, first of all, I just like to say that this collaboration that the Old Brewery has launched with McGill is really, I was feeling it's a couple of years now. It's really starting to take form, and this original vision of the community sector and the research sector kind of coming together and expanding to try to take this issue on. I really do think it has legs. I think it's got potential, great potential, if I may. But I think its continued momentum is going to need you. So many people are already involved. You're here today. But I think we'd like you to think about how to continue to be involved or get involved in the CQPI if you're interested and able, okay? So we have these 5 working groups which are working hard, 4 of which are still at the policy level, one of which the whole group around conjugal violence, which has issued its report. We're now talking about how to mobilize it. So there's really 2 phases that we think about at the CQPI, how to really get to the objective of reform, which is really thinking about what the best policy recommendations are based on the evidence, and then getting to action through mobilizing and implementing. And so with respect to 4 of them, we're still on the go. Please join us in helping to finish that reflection and then help us think about the mobilization of that. And it's obvious as well that there's more work to do. The 5 working groups that we've launched are just the start. Obviously, we need to do more work in the housing and evictions area. It's kind of just like clear. There's work to be done there. So creating that working group, I think, is clearly going to be part of our agenda. Obviously, everything to do with Indigenous homelessness, it is also flagrant that we need to start to work on that. So please put up your hand and join us in this journey if those 2 are initiatives that you'd like to be involved in. And doesn't just mean to be a member of one of these groups. There's a formal way to do that. But there's an informal way as well. I'm thinking particularly of government officials. It's not always easy to be a formal member of a group, but please informally give us advice, give us your input on some of the policy products that are starting to come out. That would be invaluable as we start to try to figure out the road to the castle. Policy change and reform, you just never know, right, when you're actually going to strike gold. And it's going to be a different pathway almost every time. So having all of that collective intelligence together is really what's, I think, going to make the difference. And there's so much great work to do in front of us here. And I'd even say some, not low-hanging fruit, but I mean, we have 3 pieces of legal work that have to be done. First, the Eliadis law. We need a housing law here in Quebec. We need the right to housing to be embedded in our charter, and need a framework legislation, so we'll call that the Eliadis legislation. We have as well, of course, the Mackey legislation. We need a duty to assist as well. We need to really put upon our institutions, those that are generating homelessness, the obligation to really work to avoid having any of their clients be referred to the street or to the shelter. Most of them aren't, but let's finish the job and do that in the explicit way that they're doing in Wales and in England and elsewhere. Why not here in Quebec? Okay. And the third one, of course, is the David Wachsmuth law. I'm sorry, I mangled your last name, but we need some more tenant protections. That is absolutely clear. We need to empower tenants to be, whether that through the notice system, whether by empowering the housing committees themselves. There's work to be done on thinking about what that piece of work is as well. Okay, and I'd also like to mention one other thing is that, you know, I've been around the homelessness sector for quite a while, and we had advice from Marie-Andre that we've got to be careful not to silo ourselves. Not to silo ourselves as the homelessness sector, and it's only us together. The big issues in front of us, housing supply, the big issues around revenue, and I would add the big issues around social isolation and loneliness. I always say at the Old Brewery Mission, like, we don't have clients if people have housing or revenue or social capital. They usually have one of those three, they're not going to be with us. And we need to work on all three, at that, also that universal prevention piece, which is so important. And there is big organizations in poverty, big organizations in housing, big organizations in youth. I think that advice to get out of, make sure we don't stay in the homelessness silo as we think about those bigger issues. I think I'm being like David, I'm using my hands here, I'm speaking with my hands, but I think we really have to think in those terms, for sure. And so, and that just leads me to just a couple of thank yous. Eric, maybe you'll do some other thank yous as well. I don't have my glasses, I hope I get these right. But we'd like to thank officially all of you, the participants in this conference. We'd like to thank the panelists and the moderators, the fabulous keynote presenters. Let's do a round of applause for our translators. You've been amazing. Our Mohawk elder, Mike, just remembering about, just to be thankful every day. Thank God we're here to be able to work on these issues, give us purpose and cause. I think that's so fantastic. Well, the staff of the faculty club as well. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. I'd like to thank our fabulous CQPI coordinator, Emily Knox. You're awesome. And I'd just like to say, as you know, one of the the sponsoring partners, but try to put in perspective that this does not get done without McGill and the Department of Equity, Ethics, and Policy putting up its hand to say, let's try a collaborative together. And here we are 2 years later. We're really getting it done. So Eric, Ari, Jen, thank you so much for your partnership. We really love working with you. To McGill, please. And with that, I pass it over to you, mon cher Eric.
Merci beaucoup, James. On m'a rappelé qu'aujourd'hui est la journée pour commémorer les femmes autochtones, comment on dit en français, missing and murdered indigenous women. Je propose qu'on prenne quelques secondes de silence pour se souvenir d'elles et de la situation qui les entoure. Au-delà de cela, James a dit beaucoup de ce que j'aurais dit moi-même. Je voudrais peut-être prendre un angle un peu différent. J'ai été très encouragé par la rencontre que nous avons eue. J'étais très encouragé aussi par les commentaires de Peter Mackey qui nous parlait du processus au Pays de Galles qui a mené au changement législatif. Ça m'a rappelé une citation que vous connaissez sans doute pour la plupart de Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, nothing else ever has. N'ayez aucun doute qu'un petit groupe de citoyens engagés peuvent changer le monde. En réalité, c'est la seule chose qui a changé le monde. C'est le seul genre de... C'est ça que ça prend pour changer le monde. Et nous sommes ici un relativement petit groupe qui prenons la voix de personnes qui n'ont pas de voix. Et alors, soyons encouragés et motivés à continuer cette lutte pour une société dans laquelle il n'y aura plus de personnes en situation d'itinérance. Et ce que nous faisons ici au niveau de développer l'axe de la prévention, c'est quelque chose de nouveau, c'est une nouvelle emphase. Mais je crois qu'il faut aussi réaliser que c'est en complémentarité avec le changement qui a été amorcé il y a déjà quelques années maintenant, de mettre l'accent sur le logement d'abord pour vraiment aider les personnes qui sont en itinérance à retrouver un logement. Donc, c'est un peu comme les deux lames d'un ciseau. On met ça ensemble avec plus de logement social, plus d'abordabilité au logement, et on arrive au résultat. Et je crois qu'il faut aussi réaliser à quel point une partie du travail auquel nous faisons face, c'est de contribuer à changer l'opinion publique pour qu'il y ait plus d'acceptation de la nécessité d'accorder plus de ressources pour venir en aide aux plus démunis. De même que quelques autres causes comme les changements climatiques, mais on n'a certainement pas besoin de dépenser autant d'argent que tant de nous le faisons sur toutes sortes d'objets de luxe et de choses dont on n'a pas vraiment besoin. Alors voilà, là-dessus je m'arrête. Je vous remercie tous. Je pense que c'est le seul groupe que James a oublié de remercier, c'est vous, d'être venus et de votre intérêt et continuons le travail. Merci. Bonne fin de semaine.